Hi, and welcome. You're listening to the X22 Report. My name is Dave, and this is episode 944B, and today's date is April 13th, 2016, and the title of the episode is U.S. Ships in Military Assets and Prepares for the Next Phase When the Ceasefire Collapses. Let's get into the economic collapse, political, and geopolitical news. Now, financial whistleblower Bradley Birkenfeld, who helped expose the American tax evaders hiding in Swiss banks, he is saying he has little doubt that the Panama Leaks scandal was crafted and orchestrated by the CIA. And he says he's absolutely positively sure that it was the CIA, citing that, and we've said this many times before, that the selective management of information exposed to the public, where it doesn't hurt the U.S. in any shape or form. And I do agree with him that they left out many of the U.S. officials. None of them was reporting on. And there is thousands and thousands of pieces of information, and the corporate media was in charge of reporting on it. Now, if they gave all this information to the alternative media, I'm sure as we delve into it, we would have found other information. But of course, as we know, this is not how it was done. Now, out in the Netherlands, the final vote is in for the referendum for Ukraine, and we're seeing that 61% of the Dutch voters, they reject the association with the Ukraine. And that is the final referendum votes. We see Ashton Carter, the U.S. Defense Secretary. He just concluded his India visit without any significant take-back. India is not really doing that much business with the U.S. They're trying to move them away from Russia, but it looks like India is still purchasing military assets from Russia and getting closer and closer to Russia. So whatever mission he had there, it did not work out as well as he wanted. Now, out in Ukraine, we know that Natalie Jaresko, who is a U.S. citizen, born in Elmhurst, Illinois, she obtained a second citizenship in Ukraine on December 2nd, 2014, and she was appointed the Minister of Finance inside Ukraine. Now, what's very interesting about this is she never gave up her U.S. citizenship. So it looks like the U.S. came in, placed this person into this area, and now she is about to take control for herself of Data Group, the Ukraine telcom company that controls 85% of the Ukrainian telecom market. So we see Joe Biden's son on the board of directors of the gas company. We see John Kerry's roommate, who was also placed in a high position in the gas company. And we see this Natalie Jaresko in Ukraine. I mean, when anyone looks at this, how can anyone say, hey, the U.S. had nothing to do with the coup d'etat inside of Ukraine? Because all you see is U.S. government officials or employees inside of the Ukrainian government taking whatever they want. I mean, the Fed flew in the middle of the night and stole the gold. The country was put into deep, deep debt. The currency devalued. The entire country placed into civil war. And we see everything completely falling apart there. And the U.S. and the U.K. and other nations are in there training the armed forces for another offensive. So the U.S. is in there and taking whatever they want at this point. Now, out in Japan, we see that Japan is getting ready to defend itself against a possible North Korean missile launch. Because U.S. media reported Tuesday that U.S. satellites gathered data from North Korea saying that they are getting ready to launch a ballistic missile and to test another nuclear weapon as soon as Wednesday, as today. And the Japanese Defense Ministry said that they were going to issue orders to shoot down any North Korean missiles that pose a threat to Japanese security. And they are getting ready to protect the people's lives if North Korea should attack. Now, we know this is all propaganda. We know they're building this up. We know they're using this to increase their military budget, to place military assets into position, to get their people ready to go to war with North Korea. That is what all this is about. Now, the U.S., on the other hand, is saying, okay, we know what North Korea is up to. They have these mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, of course, there's some argument about it actually reaching the United States, but they're saying, yes, they can reach us. So they're going to be putting in long-range radar into Alaska. And we know this is not just for North Korea. This is going to be for China, for Russia. And if you notice, they're continually placing these military assets all over the place, and they're continually doing this, building up the idea that these countries are going to be our enemies, and they're continually keeping the story alive. And even when Russia is out there trying to conduct peace talks, all they keep doing is saying Russian aggression, Russian aggression. They try to bring in China into these certain topics, but what happens is China really backs off and says, okay, we don't want to be involved with this. If the United States is playing sanctions on North Korea, we'll also place sanctions on North Korea, showing that we side with the United States. And the United States, guess what? They want everyone to realize that no, China, Russia, North Korea, Syria, Iran, and any other nation that opposes the private Western Central Bank regime, they will become the enemy of the United States government central bankers. Now, out in the Baltic Sea, the U.S. corporate media is making a really big deal because there was an Su-24 Russian fighter jet that flew very close to the USS Donald Cook. And if you remember, 2 years ago, a Russian Su-24 flew very, very close to the ship, knocked out all the electronics, and the U.S. Donald Cook had to be towed away. Well, it looks like Russian jets flew very, very close to the ship again, and the U.S. and the corporate media is making a really big deal. And we have to remember, the Russian jets that were flying very close to the ship, they're unarmed. There are no weapons on it, and we can see that maybe they were saying hi. But again, you have to remember, if there were Russian warships in the Gulf of Mexico sailing around or off the coast of, on the East Coast or on the West Coast, would U.S. fighter jets fly near the ship to see what is going on? Yes, they would. And no one would have a problem with this. But we can see what the corporate media is doing. They're trying to build this up into an incident, which there really is none. Now, out in Turkey, the media, they are very nervous to report the news right now. And you can see during a dictatorship, dictators come down very hard on the press, on freedom of speech. And I'm going to try to pronounce his name here. Metin Yilmaz, editor-in-chief, is one of the most outspoken critics of the government in the Turkish media. And he says he's saying his words and weighing his words very carefully these days, because he sees that if you step outside and you criticize Erdogan or you criticize his cabinet or anything like that, people disappear. People are taken into custody. And they're very nervous about this. We see that Erdogan is cracking down on critics in parliament who criticize him. And he's calling them terrorists, especially the People's Democratic Party. And it looks like he's going after anyone at this point that criticizes what he is doing. And this is the true nature of a dictator. But don't worry, the U.S. supports Turkey and Saudi Arabia and most of the other countries where they put in puppet governments, where they push dictatorship. Now, out in Libya, we realize that the unity government, they are trying to take full control of the country, and we see that they are backed by the UN, the US, UK, Italy, and many other nations. And we see Italy's foreign minister, he's made a trip to Tripoli to meet the UN-backed unity government, and we can see that plans are in motion. Most likely, as we know, they're going to try to bring in troops into Libya. They have troops on standby. They have everything ready to go to get into the country and to push those people who object to the puppet government. And we see at this point, all they need is the unity government to be voted into power. And we see on Monday, the Libya parliament is going to vote on the unity government. Now, if they say, okay, yes, they are now the new power, we will then see, I'm not saying a split second later, but a couple weeks later, we will see troops, we will see bombers, we will see everything happen in Libya. And what's very interesting is that Obama is out there and he keeps talking about his mistakes in Libya, how he should have kept going and taken the next step. And I think what they're doing at this point is building it up, saying, listen, he needs to take the next step now. We need to bring in ground troops. We need to bring in the bombers. We need to go into Libya and finish what we started. And what did they do? Well, they needed to take complete control of the country, push back all those people who object to the puppet government, and keep the puppet government in power. And I think this is his message that he's continually pushing out there to get everyone ready and willing to go back into Libya to finish the job. Now, out in Syria, Russia's envoy to the UN, Natalie Jaresko, said that the U.S. should do everything it can to stop the terrorist flow from Turkey to Syria. Well, I don't see that happening whatsoever because, as we know, all these terrorist groups work for the U.S. government. They work for the coalition forces. They're in line with Turkey. And they're going to keep those areas where the terrorists can flow through open. They're not going to close them up. Actually, they're going to protect them. So we are already seeing the plan that the U.S. has put together. And we see that their next plan, I don't know, this plan Z now, but their next plan, if the ceasefire talks should fail, is to load up the moderate rebels and all the terrorists with weapons. Now, we know a lot of weapons have been delivered to Syria. We know a lot of ammunition. We know man-pads. But if the ceasefire collapses, if the negotiations don't go anywhere, which we know this is their whole tactic, the U.S. is going to pull back the throttle on the civil war and all bets will be off. They will double or triple down, throwing everything they can into Syria, including lethal weaponry. Now, think about what they're doing here. If they bring in more of these lethal weapons, like man-pads and many other of these type of weapons, and they start shooting down Syrian jets, Russian jets, there's going to be a major problem. There's going to be an escalation in the war in Syria. And this is exactly what they want. Because at every turn, they don't want these ceasefire talks to go forward. Russia and Syria, they would like this entire war just to end. And this is why they're pushing for these ceasefire talks. The U.S. is pretending to be for the ceasefire talks because they're using it as breathing room to reorganize, because they were losing the battle in Syria once Russia stepped in. So they had to come up with a new plan. And remember, way back, Assad said he was going to have parliamentary elections in Syria, and they're taking place now. And Lavrov is saying that they need these elections because this will prevent a legal vacuum in the country until a new constitution is worked out. And of course, at that point, they're going to have the people vote for Assad. Now, some of the Syrian opposition fighters in Damascus, they're going to vote in the parliamentary election. Now, the parliamentary elections, there are over 3,500 candidates trying to get about 350 seats in Syria's parliament. Some 7,000 polling stations are open across the country. Now, the U.S. is dismissing the poll before it even started. They're saying, nope, I'm sorry, Mark Toner is out there, and he's saying these are not legitimate because they don't represent the will of the Syrian people, like he knows what the will of the Syrian people are or is. And what we're seeing right now is kind of hypocritical because in Ukraine, they had elections when Crimea was voted away and the southeastern people were in battle with the Ukrainian government But at that time, they said, oh, no, no, this is the will of the people. Here's the elections. Okay, Poroshenko's in power. In Iraq, they did the same thing. And here we are where they're saying, no, this can't be done. Well, they did it in other places. Why can't it be done here? Well, the reason why is because they're very nervous. They understand that when the people are voting, they are telling the world that this is what they want. And Washington has a problem with this because this is not what they want. And they don't like listening to the people. And they're very nervous about the people voting for Assad. They're never going to let this happen. I mean, I'd be shocked if they let it get this far. And this is why we see all these weapons, these military assets, the troop buildup happening right now. And what we're seeing is Russia is very worried about this buildup of 10,000 plus troops in Aleppo because they're all on standby right now, waiting for the ceasefire talks to completely break down so they can start the next offensive. And this one is going to be bloodier and a lot worse than it was before. And why are they doing this? Because they realize that this entire system that they have is failing. And they're running out of time. So as we know, they're going to be planning some type of an event. And in Morocco, the head of counterterrorism, he found information and is warning the world that the Islamic State, they're trying to build a chemical weapon that will be used in Europe. Now we know Turkey and Saudi Arabia, they are producing chemical weapons right on the border of Syria and Turkey, handing them over to the Islamic State. Morocco's head of counterterrorism found a group. They discovered components during a raid on one of the cells in Morocco. And this is where the U.S. keeps these proxy groups to use them later on in an attack. And we see at this point that whatever happens, wherever we see this next event, and we know this next event is not going to be a shootout event. It's not going to be a small bomb in an airport or a rail terminal. It's going to be much, much larger because they need to convince the world that terrorism is scary. Terrorism is something we need to all band together. Well, only those countries and those groups they want together. And we need to go after them. And we can see right now they're trying to scare Europe into bringing in more forces into this area. We know from the Saudis, who was one of the princes that was doing an interview where he said releasing the refugees into Europe was to push Europe into helping bring Assad out of power. And we see at this point that the next phase of this is to push Europe into saying, okay, enough is enough. We need to go into Syria and stop all of this. And of course, what they're really trying to make Europe do is to help them get rid of Assad. Help them go to war with Russia, because that's where it's going to lead. Now, do all the plans work out for the central bankers, the U.S. government? No, we've seen a lot of them fail. We've seen Russia step in and say, whoa, wait a minute. If Assad gets rid of chemical weapons, can we have peace? Well, what is the U.S. going to say? No. We see the U.S. trying in Ukraine. And, of course, Russia once again stepped in and came up with the Minsk I and the Minsk II peace deals. We see out in Syria, where Russia was never invited to help with the Islamic State, get rid of them. China was never invited in because they knew that they would find out that they're really not fighting the Islamic State. So Russia joined up with Syria, and Syria, Assad, said, hey, step in, help us get rid of terrorism. And Russia actually came in and did this. Well, this is the opposite of what the U.S. wants. So we see we're at this point where the U.S. is going to have to convince Europe, convince the people of the world to go to war. And when they do this event, Europe most likely will say, okay, enough is enough. But this will then lead into the next World War. And we'll have to wait to see if their plan works, because if it doesn't work, they'll have another plan. If that plan doesn't work, they'll have another. Because if we go back in time, everyone thought it was done after the sarin gas attack. After Assad got rid of his chemical weapons, they said, oh, okay, they're just going to have a civil war. But it never ends. Their goal is always the same. They're never going to give up. In their heads, they believe that they can continually prop up the system. And if they can't prop it up, they say, okay, we have no alternative. We don't want to be blamed for this because we want to restart the system. So what should we do to take all eyes off the central bank? I know, let's start a war. This will confuse everyone. And we'll say the economy's failing because of the war. And this is their main push. It's to go to war, because this entire system is completely falling apart. Listen, everyone, thanks a lot for listening. Be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.